I want to read out loud two books. Of course, I'm not going to do it in one video, one shot. It will be broken into many pieces, many videos separately. These two books are no ordinary books. They are extremely remarkable, extremely unique. The first book is Adolf Hitler's autobiography. The name is called Kampf. I don't know how to pronounce exactly because it is in German, the title. If you translate the title into English, it means My Struggle. Of course, I'm going to read the English translated version. Another book the name is Communist Manifesto, written by Karl Marx. These two books are very interesting because they represent the two extreme opposite ends of ideology. All right. On one hand, we know Adolf Hitler, the Nazi leader, how atrocious, how inhumane he was, conducted the Holocaust, waged World War II, and of course killed so many people. Adolf Hitler represented the extreme right wing, racist, Nazism, and then on the other hand, Communist Manifesto. This book and also Karl Marx himself represents the other end, the left-wing politics. Of course, its ideology is communism. Communism comes from the word commune, and commune comes from the word common. Its ideology is about every single person, especially every single workers or farmers, co-own and co-share means of production. So he envisioned a world without hierarchy, without private property ownership. So this represents the most left-hand side. I want to read these two books because I think it is not only interesting but also important to think, why are there certain people who would have thought of something so extreme that would be regarded as forbidden today. Of course, Nazism is forbidden today. Anybody who mentions the word Nazi, or anybody who remotely mentions about disqualifying or discriminating a certain group of people based on gender, IQ, race, he or she will be immediately labeled as a Nazi and then will be ostracized by the general public. And meanwhile, on the left-hand side, it's a bit interesting. If you go to China, of course, if you say, oh, Communist Manifesto is very extreme, the 1.2 billion Chinese people would just ignore you, would regard you as a lunatic. They don't think Karl Marx is crazy. In fact, today, 1.2 billion Chinese people are still fighting that ideal envisioned by Karl Marx. But however, it's a bit sardonic, a bit poignant. Originally, Karl Marx ideology sounds very noble. In fact, it sounds incredibly virtuous. Why would that ideology be regarded as extreme today? Why would it be regarded as evil, as outrageous as Nazism on the right wing? Don't you find it interesting? For example, in Malaysia, communism is definitely quite a forbidden topic, particularly because back then the Malayan Communist Party by Jinping committed some form of atrocity in Malaysia after the evacuation of Japanese army. So today in many countries in the world, except those rare socialistic and communistic countries, very rare Soviet bloc, the second world countries, except those, majority of the countries in the world today treat communism as a forbidden topic. You don't read Karl Marx, you definitely don't want to teach that in schools. So don't you find interesting something that talk about a world that has no hierarchy. It was absolute equality, but today it happens to be something as evil as Nazism. Of course, the reason has a lot to do with how incompatible communism and Karl Marx ideology are when it is being applied to the real world, because real world is chaotic. In physics, we studied second law of thermodynamics. Entropy will only increases all the time. There's no way for you to force absolute equality except through violence. That's why all the communistic countries or societies, Soviet or even China, had to resort to violence, and North Korea had to resort to violence so often, kill so many people, causing famine and so on. Then, so I'm going to read these two books, and then you might ask, oh, why do you want to read these two books? Of course, I want to find out. It's mere curiosity. But secondly, I think these two books are less dangerous than most people think, because I kind of subscribing to a kind of positive fatalism. I think if you are a smart and wise person, having read these two books thoroughly will not change your mind. And if you are inherently stupid, if you are already a stupid person, all right, even if you really listen to the populace and avoid from reading these two books, denouncing these two books and as pure evil, even if you don't read them, you would still do stupid things due to the influence of other things, external circumstances. Hence, for me, the effects of these two books are quite low. But I'm very interested to find out what these two books generally talk about. All right, so I was first start with Kampf. First and foremost, I believe a lot of words, a lot of the places and some characters are named in German language, and therefore I don't know how to pronounce them correctly. I will just wing it. I will just try to guess, and it might be a really bad pronunciation, but other words I will try to pronounce as a normal English. So chapter 1, in the home of my parents. It has turned out fortunate for me today that destiny appointed Braunau-on-the-Inn to be my birthplace, for that little town is situated just on the frontier between those two states, the reunion of which seems, at least to us of the younger generation, a task to which we should devote our lives and in the pursuit of which every possible means should be employed. German Austria must be restored to the great German motherland, and not indeed on any grounds of economic calculation whatsoever. No, no. Even if the Union were a matter of economic indifference, and even if it were to be disadvantageous from the economic standpoint, still it ought to take place. People of the same blood should be in the same reach. The German people will have no right to engage in a colonial policy until they shall have brought all their children together in the one state. When the territory of the rich embraces all the Germans and finds itself unable to assure them a livelihood, only then can the moral right arise from the need of the people to acquire foreign territory. The plough is then the sword, and the tears of war will produce the daily bread for the generations to come. And so this little frontier town appeared to me as a symbol of a great task, but in another regard also, it points to a lesson that is applicable to our day. Over 100 years ago, this sequestered spot was the scene of a tragic calamity which affected the whole German nation and will be remembered forever, at least in the annals of German history. At the time of our fatherland's deepest humiliation, a bookseller, Johannes Palm, uncompromising nationalist and enemy of the French, was put to death here because he had the misfortune to have loved Germany well. He obstinately refused to disclose the names of his associates, or rather the principals who were chiefly responsible for the affair. Just as it happened with Leo Schlageter, the former, like the latter, was denounced to the French by a government agent. It was a director of police from Augsburg who won an ignoble renown on that occasion and set the example which was to be copied at a later date by the new German officials of the Reich under Herr Severin's regime. In this little town on the Inn, haloed by the memory of a German martyr, a town that was Bavarian by blood but under the rule of the Austrian state, my parents were domiciled towards the end of the last century. My father was a civil servant who fulfilled his duties very conscientiously. My mother looked after the household and lovingly devoted herself to the care of her children. From that period, I have not retained very much in my memory, because after a few years, my father had to leave that frontier town which I had come to love so much and take up a new post farther down the Inn Valley at Passau, therefore actually in Germany itself. In those days, it was the usual lot of an Austrian civil servant to be transferred periodically from one post to another. Not long after coming to Passau, my father was transferred to Linz, and while there he retired finally to live on his pension. But this did not mean that the old gentleman would now rest from his labors. He was the son of a poor cottager, and while still a boy he grew restless and left home. When he was barely 13 years old, he buckled on his satchel and set forth from his native woodland parish. Despite the dissuasion of villagers who could speak from experience, he went to Vienna to learn a trade there. This was in the 50th year of the last century. It was a sore trial, that of deciding to leave home and face the unknown, with 3 gulden in his pocket. By when the boy of 13 was a lad of 17 and had passed his apprenticeship examination as a craftsman, he was not content. Quite the contrary. The persistent economic depression of that period and the constant want and misery strengthened his resolution to give up working at a trade and strive for something higher. As a boy, it had seemed to him that the position of the parish priest in his native village was the highest in the scale of human attainment. But now that the big city had enlarged his outlook, the young man looked up to the dignity of a state official as the highest of all. With the tenacity of one whom misery and trouble had already made old when only halfway through his youth, the young man of 17 obstinately set out on his new project and stuck to it until he won through. He became a civil servant. He was about 23 years old, I think, when he succeeded in making himself what he had resolved to become. Thus he was able to fulfill the promise he had made as a poor boy not to return to his native village until he was somebody. He had gained his end. But in the village there was nobody who had remembered him as a little boy, and the village itself had become strange to him. Now at last, when he was 56 years old, he gave up his active career, but he could not bear to be idle for a single day. On the outskirts of the small market town of Lambach in Upper Austria, he bought a farm and tilled it himself. Thus, at the end of a long and hard-working career, he came back to the life which his father had led. It was at this period that I first began to have ideals of my own. I spent a good deal of time scampering about in the open, on the long road from school, and mixing up some of the roughest of the boys, which caused my mother many anxious moments. I'll stop here. I'll continue the second read in another episode. See you. Goodbye.